Excited to be joined by Phil Baty, Chief Knowledge Officer of the Times of Higher Education. Phil, welcome to BbWorld.
Thanks for having me.
So Phil, has the COVID-19 pandemic permanently altered students' expectations for higher education?
I think so, yes. Look, it's been a terrible time for students, really, that they were expecting to be spending their time on campus. They've been prevented from meeting their peers, from getting on campus, and they've been, distanced from some of the transformative elements of being face-to-face with their peers on a campus. They've missed out. But I also think, actually, the stereotype, the cliche that students are stuck in their parents' basements and just taking lecture after lecture on Zoom is really unfair. It's not really an accurate reflection of what's happening. There has been remarkable innovation, I think, in learning technology during this crisis. Universities have adapted incredibly well. I think some of the more permanent changes will be, I think, perhaps the death of the traditional large in-person lecture. I think we've recognized that's not really fit for purpose anymore. There will be in-person activity, but I think it'll be group-based learning, small seminar classes, problem-solving sessions, and a blended approach where actually a lot of content may stay online, may stay digital and remote. So there's a much more of a blended approach, a more flexible approach. And I also think perhaps this pandemic might start to kill off the traditional high-stakes exam. The sense of a 3-hour exam with 3 essays if you're in the humanities or social science subjects. It doesn't reflect real life. It's not easy to do online. Maybe we'll find better forms of assessment that are more fit for purpose for the real world outside of the lecture theatre, outside of university. So problem-based challenges, group-based challenges, different ways of assessing. So I think there'll be a permanent shift in a more blended approach to higher education, mixing all the great things that have happened with learning technology and some of the face-to-face aspects that people crave, and a reforming of assessment as well.
Absolutely. Some changes to come for sure. So tell us, what's a way higher education will look different over the next 5 years that most folks just aren't currently anticipating?
Well, actually, from my perspective, I think because we look at things at a global level from Times Higher Education, we have a lot of data. I think actually the geopolitics of education is changing. We traditionally had a sense that if you're an ambitious, talented student in East Asia, you're naturally inclined to travel west, to go to Western Europe or North America for your education. I think that's being challenged now. I think it's challenged immediately as a result of the pandemic and the closure of borders and restrictions on travel. But it was already changing in terms of the market share, the flows of talent. There's more east-to-east international study. The US is still the most popular destination by far in the world, but its market share is declining. So the talent flows will change. And I think the relative financial suffering of universities will also disproportionately hit the Western universities, the marketized systems, where the economy's ability to fund higher education is a bit more constrained. And the loss of student tuition fees is also harmful as well. Whereas in the East, we're seeing the rise of really strong universities in mainland China, in Singapore, in Hong Kong, South Korea. So I think there's actually a shift in global talent flows and the geopolitics of knowledge. But hopefully everyone wins from that as a society, because it's all about, a rising tide lifts all boats.
And you touched on this in your previous answer. I kind of wanted to come back to this. So what weaknesses in the higher education system has the pandemic revealed? And how do you think institutions can work to correct them?
Yes, I think, I mentioned actually, I think forms of assessment perhaps haven't evolved enough. They were starting to evolve, but perhaps we relied too much on traditional high stakes exams that actually, were designed, generations ago and hadn't really evolved enough to reflect the new ways that students, obtain knowledge, the accessibility of information and facts, and actually the shift towards being more prepared for real life, where you're hit with the unexpected, you're hit with a problem. It's about how you tackle and approach a problem and solve it rather than how much knowledge you have. So there's a whole issue around assessment, I think. But for me, perhaps the most alarming thing, the biggest challenge that the pandemic has not revealed, but has actually really highlighted as an issue is access and inequality. We do have this issue that too many students are denied access to opportunity through education, whether that's through prohibitive costs of study, whether that's through, systemic inequalities in society that have, caused issues earlier down the chain in terms of earlier years education. But I think there's an opportunity here for universities to fling open the opportunities through technology. Tech can help not just provide better access to education, perhaps at a better, more economical way in terms of cost, but also it can provide solutions to challenges that people from less traditional backgrounds have, for example, in using data to monitor performance, to highlight potential challenges that people face. For example, if they have caring responsibilities or they need to take paid employment to make ends meet. So the flexibility, the use of data to focus interventions and support for students so they can complete. All these things I think are really exciting and positive, but of course, it is a huge problem. We need to work together as a sector to address inequality of access to higher education.
Lowering barriers for all students. I wanted to follow up with this question too. So, Phil, what really surprised you in the past year?
I think probably the most surprising thing was the sheer flexibility and agility that universities displayed when their core mission was under threat. Almost overnight, it's not a cliche to say, almost overnight, they had to pivot to delivering mass remote education, and it happened all over the world, and it happened extremely quickly. So that's been amazing. There's an old saying that I've been repeating quite a lot, that universities can change the course of history through their inventions, their innovations, their great discoveries, but they can't change a history course because they're tied down by bureaucracy, their committee structures, their red tape. They're just very bad at moving quickly. I think the pandemic has completely shattered that myth. They can innovate, they can make really quick, agile decisions when faced with problems. And I think that's something that we should actually celebrate. It's been driven by a crisis, driven by a terrible global pandemic, but the innovation, the resilience, the agility is something we should bottle and harness and really turn it for the good to make sure that we get the very best out of the innovations that we've seen through the pandemic, keep hold of them, and don't just revert back to the old ways. And we learn all the lessons and make all the improvements that we've been able to experiment with by necessity this year.
Phil Baty, enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for joining us here at BbWorld.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.